Hey folks, happy Monday to you. Happy President's Day to you. We've got a big show lined up. As you probably know, I was a big fan of the program The West Wing. I still am. I created a project called Chasing the Hill with the guy who played Toby on this show, and I just remain a fan to this day. One of the writers, supervising producer, won an Emmy for a documentary about the West Wing, but also wrote some of those amazing episodes of the program and was on it for 5 seasons. Eli Attie is going to be on the program today. Chatted with him just a couple days ago from Santa Monica, where he lives with his family, but talking all about how those, because he was Al Gore's speechwriter. He worked in the White House. He worked on Capitol Hill. And then his transition from politics to first reaching out to Aaron Sorkin to getting on the West Wing team. What a great story. You're going to hear all about it direct from Eli Attie. So huge thanks to him for taking time to really chat with us about those episodes, moving from California to Iowa here to participate actually in presidential politics, running John Delaney's Iowa campaign and other campaigns here being involved. And to see, I was inspired by those Matt Santos campaign episodes. And of course, Matt Del Negro ended up being in our project, Chasing the Hill. Those episodes, King Corn, where Alan Alda is having problems with the ethanol mandate, which we call the RFS here, the Renewable Fuel Standard. So all of that and seeing it fictionalized and then living through it and talking with him about all that, you're going to want to stick around for that. Also on today's episode, former State Representative Karin Derry. Not only did she love the West Wing as well, but we're going to talk about the redistricting that's going on here in Iowa right now. One of the beautiful things about Iowa politics, if you look at our state, the rectangle, it's just basically a nice, beautiful grid. This district is so pretty. It's just a sight to behold. It's beauty in politics. So we're going to talk about that and some other things. Also, her future in politics, former state rep Karin Derry. And then Wednesday, this gentleman, State Representative Ross Wilburn, is also the former mayor of Iowa City. He just got elected to be the chair of the Iowa Democratic Party. He's going to be on Wednesday morning live. You're going to want to check that out. There he is standing with now Vice President Kamala Harris. He was one of the senior advisors to her campaign. So just, Ross Wilburn, everything he touches turns to gold. So excited, very excited to talk with him, not only about what's going on in the Capitol right now, because he is serving right now, representing a district up in the Ames area, but what's going on in national politics and also what happened on the Iowa Black Caucus Zoom meeting just a few days ago that they were hacked into and horrible things were said. They had to shut the meeting down. They actually had Congresswoman Joyce Beatty was there. She was speaking, and it's just a disgraceful show of racism and what's going on with that and how they're moving forward to make sure that doesn't happen again. So all that on today's President's Day episode. Thank you so much for being with us. And since we're talking about the West Wing, I'm going to show you the interview with Eli, but right before that, a piece that I produced and directed with the cast of the West Wing about veterans. Let's take a look.
A decade of war has taken an unprecedented toll on our men and women in uniform.
Most veterans return to our communities as leaders, but everyone's journey home is not the same.
Hundreds of thousands of our veterans are suffering from the trauma of war.
Without assistance, the downward spiral can be quick and destructive.
It doesn't have to be this way.
At Justice for Vets, we believe that every veteran should have the opportunity for treatment and restoration.
Justice for Vets is the only national organization dedicated to the expansion of veterans' treatment courts.
Veterans treatment courts hold our veterans accountable for their actions.
By providing structure, treatment, and mentoring, these courts help our veterans and their families get their lives back on track.
And veterans treatment courts work.
We ask much of our men and women in uniform, and they ask little in return. It is our collective duty to come to their aid when they struggle on the home front. This not only honors their sacrifice, but makes our communities stronger.
A donation to Justice for Vets helps put a veterans treatment court within reach of every veteran in need.
A donation to Justice for Vets keeps veterans and treatment where they belong.
A donation to Justice for Vets shows your commitment to leaving no veteran behind.
A donation to Justice for Vets will help save lives, restore families, and rebuild communities.
Get involved. and go to justiceforvets.org.
Veterans fought for our freedom. Now it's our turn to fight for theirs. Thank you.
Hi, folks. Welcome back to the program. Always grateful to have guests on the show, and today is no exception. All the way from Santa Monica, California, producer, writer extraordinaire, Eli Attie. Thanks so much for being on today, Eli.
It's a great pleasure, Brent. Happy to be here.
So, you are just one of the most hardest working folks in show business. Not only, you've got some amazing credits, but you've got a politics background. So before we talk about, you producing The West Wing and The House and other big shows, you were involved with the Al Gore campaign.
Yeah, that's right. At a young age, I was Al Gore's chief speechwriter. I started working for him about 6 months into his second term, Clinton's second term, his second term as vice president. And I stayed with him till the very dying embers of the Florida recount. And it was an incredible experience. I don't even know how to sum it up. I think in some ways the battle of the Florida recount sort of presaged a lot of the partisan battles that we've seen, in last weeks, even with the impeachment trial that's going on right now, just people trying to will outcomes, that they wanted. And it was a very searing, probably psychologically damaging experience to me. And something I think I've been unpacking in my writing and in my own life ever since, in a lot of ways.
It's so interesting, though, the difference between that election recount drama and what we just went through. Do you think, you mentioned it might have kind of paved the way, so to speak, but what do you think about how different those approaches were? I mean, Bush versus Gore at least was handled in the courts and felt that at least it was a bit more civilized.
It didn't feel civilized at the time. There certainly weren't any armed insurrections. Nobody stormed any buildings. But I think we saw in the recount, in the way the two sides conducted themselves, our side, the Gore team, and the George W. Bush campaign and legal team, a sort of a foreshadowing of the different approaches, I think, by Democrats and Republicans today. The Republicans then had a sort of a scorched earth approach. They were fighting by every means possible to prevent the counting of votes that they thought would hurt them. And I think the Gore campaign, we were very concerned about kind of the way that it would be seen, especially by elite opinion and by the country at large. I mean, this was kind of new territory to have a recount in a presidential race. It felt like something out of, the 1850s or something. And the concern was, that the country would lose patience with us because the election had been called for George Bush on election night by first his cousin, John Ellis, the political director of Fox News at the time, and then by Bob Wright, the chairman of General Electric, who kind of ordered NBC to call it, and he was a huge Bush donor. But there was this presumption of victory that hung over Bush because the networks had briefly called it for him. And so I think we were very conscious about not wanting to be seen as sore losers or protesting an outcome we didn't like. We cherry-picked some individual counties in Florida where we thought we could ask for, smaller recounts that were measured and reasonable. And in retrospect, we probably didn't need to be so reasonable. I think it's almost beyond question now in history that more people went into voting booths in Florida in the year 2000 intending to vote for Al Gore than George Bush, and came out of those voting booths thinking they had voted for for Al Gore as opposed to George Bush. And yet the tangle of the courts and the way the Supreme Court stopped the count, we didn't really end up with a full and accurate count of that state. And, we were playing by Marquess of Queensberry rules, and they were just playing by very different rules. And I think that has continued to be true in some ways.
And then, so what's interesting about that, so you're right there in the belly of the beast in politics in this country at the highest levels. And then you make this transition into show business with the show called The West Wing, which literally inspired my route into politics. Talk about that transition. And I think you started out as a consulting producer first, or how did it go?
No, actually, it's funny. I even though I was working in presidential politics as you say, at the highest level, I mean, I hung around with Al Gore all day. I was writing his speeches and I needed a lot of proximity to him. I was a kid. I mean, I was, barely 30. And, given, I wouldn't even say, it wasn't like I was making policy. I was mostly writing, and I didn't consider myself a writer, and I didn't set out to be a writer, but it was something I had a facility for. And I really didn't know, I'd spent 7 years in Washington on Capitol Hill and in the White House. And when the Florida recount ground to a halt, I didn't know what was next for me. And I was burned out on politics. It's the old cliche, politics left me. I didn't leave politics. I didn't have a job. I didn't want to go back to Capitol Hill, which is where I had started. And a friend of mine from college, who at the time was a talent agent, made a joke to me. I was a speechwriter, and he said, "You should sell out and become a screenwriter." Speechwriter, screenwriter. And so, I was unemployed, literally on unemployment insurance, as all my friends from the Gore campaign were, people my age. And we were all going to bars and restaurants at night and just talking about our futures. Are you planning to move to New York? Are you planning to go work on the Hill? And I started saying to people, because I knew someone else from college who was a television writer, and I knew teams of people wrote TV shows. I knew I couldn't write a movie. I didn't know how to do that. But I started saying to people, maybe I'll move to Los Angeles and become a TV writer. I don't really know, other than my friend sending me this email, I don't know what motivated me to say that. And every single person to a person, maybe 40 people in the space of a couple of weeks, said to me, "The West Wing, you should go work on The West Wing." It had been on the air for, I think, a year and a half at that point. I'd only seen maybe 1.5 episodes, and I wasn't even really paying attention. But it was a show about what I did, and I was aware that it was a hit show and in the culture, and people were talking about the characters by name in the background sometimes when I was in a campaign meeting. And so then I watched a couple episodes on the air. You couldn't even get DVDs at that time. And it hadn't yet come out on DVD. And I loved it. I sort of watched it thinking, could this be something I could do? And the genius of Aaron Sorkin is that the dialogue is so breezy and fun and effortless that I thought, that doesn't look hard to write. I mean, it's very hard to write, but it just seemed easy. And so, I'd worked on a presidential campaign, and a lot of the time Al Gore would say to me, I just read an article by this economist at the University of Chicago, let's fly him in and let's sit down with him. And I would just have to track this person down. And so that was something I did all the time. So I just thought to myself, I should call this guy Aaron Sorkin. And at the time, somebody who ran a TV show in Hollywood seemed completely unimportant to me. It's somebody you would ask for a $2,000 check. And so I wasn't approaching this as any great moment in my life, but I actually, from my little apartment in Washington, D.C. at the time, I called Los Angeles Information. I asked for the number of NBC because the show aired on NBC, and got that general number, called that number, and I said, I'm trying to reach the TV show, The West Wing. And they said, actually, you need to call the studio, which is Warner Brothers. Here's that number. So I called that number, and I said, I'm trying to reach The West Wing. They switched me over to somewhere. I said, I'm trying to reach Aaron Sorkin. And they switched me over to somewhere else. And a woman answered the phone who actually still works closely with Aaron today. And I said, he doesn't know me. I was Al Gore's speechwriter till 2 weeks ago. I'm calling to talk to him. Long hold. And then he gets on the phone. And, knowing him well now and having sort of worked with him on and off for years, he was probably sitting in front of a blank screen thinking, what do I do right now? And here's a guy calling him, not that he didn't have tons of consultants and advisors. And I just basically said, I'm not asking you for a job, but and he didn't know who I was, but he was kind of very nice and excited to talk to somebody from the Gore campaign. And I said, I'm interested in being a TV writer. Maybe you'd have a cup of coffee with me. And in a moment that changed my life, really, he said, I'd love to consider you for a job. And I said, I'm going to, come out to LA at some point. He said, great, call my assistant and set it up. I flew out, I met with him for half an hour, and I started the next season on the show as a full-fledged writer. I mean, the most entry-level writer there can be. And I just loved it. And I learned so much with him and the other writers there. And I had so much fun. And I slowly learned how to write scenes and stories. And it was incredible therapy for me. And everybody, Aaron included, from that show is still a cherished friend. So it was a great experience in my life.
What are some of the key episodes you worked on that are just your favorites?
It's not for me to say really. Something I was fond of that was an episode I wrote in the post-Sorkin era of the show is an episode called Fredonia, which is about the Jimmy Smits character, Matt Santos, kind of coming into his own. I'll always be very fond of an episode that I co-wrote with Kevin Falls called Swiss Diplomacy, that we co-wrote when Aaron was still on the show. But, a lot of my job in my early days on the show was just feeding ideas to Aaron, storylines, bits of dialogue, anything that might inspire him. And he's so exacting and has such great taste. To just get a line that he thought was good in a script felt exciting to me. And, I worked with him recently on the HBO Max West Wing reunion and had so much fun just collaborating with him again and getting an upfront sort of seat at his creativity. He's just so full of energy and ideas and such an artist, I think. So, I don't know what's a good or bad episode of the show at this point. Haven't watched them really, with a few exceptions, in a long time, but it was a magical time for me. I think it's a great show. I was lucky to be a part of it.
I did a project called Chasing the Hill with Richard Schiff, who played Toby on that program.
That's
and
right.
We did an interview with New York Times, and he said that the Matt Santos campaign on that show absolutely ushered the way for the Obama campaign. And I believe that you saw a lot of similarities between those two people, the Santos character and Senator Obama. Is that right?
Yeah, it wasn't so much that I saw similarities. I didn't initiate the character of Matt Santos. I mean, it was John Wells' idea. He ran the show after Aaron took over, and another writer had thrown him into a few scenes. In fact, I think 2 writers had used him in 3 or 4 or 5 scenes in other episodes. But John asked me to write 2 entire episodes all about that character, basically, that were going to be set on location in Iowa and New Hampshire. He wrote a 3rd episode set in Iowa, and those 3 episodes were going to be shot together. And they ended up being shot in Canada. So I sat down and I had an hour and a half of Matt Santos to write, and we didn't know much about him. He was a mayor, he was Latino, now he was in Congress. What was, and the writer's room led by John, came up with the idea of a very politically attractive sort of Latino front runner for the Democratic nomination. Well, he didn't even start as a front runner, but just a very viable candidate, as being something that was kind of coming next in our politics anyway, right? And maybe it was our California centrism, but it just, I tried to look for, at the time, a good model for a Matt Santos character, somebody, maybe a state legislator or somebody who seemed to be kind of rising on the scene. And I was having a bit of trouble. I mean, there's a lot of interesting, very compelling Latino politicians at the time, but I couldn't really find what I was looking for. And then I saw Barack Obama's convention address in 2004. And even though he wasn't Latino, he just seemed to be post-racial, the next thing, somebody with a lot of charisma and appeal, somebody who could be a kind of a singular exception to a lot of rules. And he was still a state legislator at the time. He hadn't even won his Senate seat, although he was about to. And I knew his political consultant, a guy named David Axelrod. We had worked together a little bit and were friendly. And I called him and we had a couple long phone conversations. And, a lot of what he told me, I sort of poured into the character. So it wasn't so much that that I saw parallels. I just had a lot of pages to fill. And here was somebody who seemed like a pretty good analog. So, a lot of my understanding of Obama at that moment kind of fed into some of those early Matt Santos episodes. And then, of course, Obama ran for president, which I didn't know was really going to ever happen. And at one point I got a funny, delightful email from David Axelrod saying, from the campaign trail with Obama, "We're living your scripts." So, art imitates life, imitates art, imitates life.
Oh, that's fantastic. I want to give a shout out to actor Matthew Del Negro, who was in those seasons as well. He was on our project, Chasing the Hill. But what's interesting about
actor, a good friend.
Oh, he's fantastic. Actually, Santa Monica, yeah, close to you.
Yeah, I think technically in the Palisades, maybe, but he's nearby.
What's interesting about those seasons, I noticed it as a viewer, the shift between campaign trail and what we had gotten used to on the West Wing, which is traditional filmmaking, moody lighting and all that, and all of a sudden we're fluorescent lighting, hotel rooms, the countryside, etc. How much of that was, I mean, obviously discussed and planned, but just a totally different approach to the world of politics, it seems.
Yeah, I mean, it was intentional. Aaron Sorkin is a genius. John Wells is also a genius. And I think part of John's genius was in recognizing and sort of leading the post-Aaron writing staff of the show in realizing we're not going to write the Aaron version of the show any better. And also there have been 88 episodes of it. So, those stories have largely been told, maybe more than largely, they've been told. So what can we do that's different? And that's what led John to the idea that we would run the next campaign to succeed the Martin Sheen character, to succeed Jed Bartlett. And so I think we were all at that point looking for ways to honor what the show had been, the tone, the style. A lot of the characters remained in place. Some moved around a little bit, but to just do different things. And, it was interesting because Aaron really wanted to write about the presidency and about the White House in season 3. When I started on the show, he shied away from doing too much on the campaign trail. He was interested in Bartlett as president. And so, I remember there was an Iowa episode in season 3. I can't remember all the details of it, but as I recall, I think it was called The Two Bartletts. I think we see the flight to Iowa and we see the flight back from Iowa. I don't think we actually see Iowa. So part of what we were trying to do was to show Iowa, was to just show the things you actually do when you're really campaigning. And obviously none of our candidates were already president. So, they didn't have a lot of other stuff to do during the day. So
one of the Iowa episodes, obviously I'm in Iowa right now. I actually was inspired to come here partially by those seasons, although I do have a Midwest upbringing. The King Corn episode, right. Alan Alda's character is conflicted talking about the ethanol subsidies, yes. which is still very much alive. That sure. issue is very much alive. It's called the RFS now, Renewable Fuel Standard. But yeah, those episodes are legendary here in Iowa politics. So very cool. What do you see as, so it's been a few years since West Wing was off the air. You just did the HBO special. You mentioned that, where it was a right. live theatrical version of it. But what inspired me about the West Wing and to get into politics was West Wing wasn't afraid to aspire. It wasn't afraid to inspire audiences and kind of reach for levels of profundity that a lot of shows don't. They let themselves get a little jaded, yeah. and West Wing kind of wore it on their sleeve. What do you think of it? Does the current political discussion suffer because there isn't something like the West Wing, and should we bring it back?
I would never claim or pretend that the West Wing had too big of an impact on real politics. I think to some degree it's something people enjoy if they're already interested in real politics, for the most part. And maybe it turns a few people on to it who weren't interested in it, but it's entertainment at the end of the day, and you're following characters in their lives. And we would always try to include a little bit of spinach about the issues that you could ignore if you didn't care, or that you could follow if you were interested. So it's hard for me to say something like that is missing or not missing. I mean, look, I know a lot of the people. The incredible thing when looking back on the West Wing is that Ron Klain, the White House Chief of Staff under Biden, Tony Blinken, the Secretary of State, Evan Ryan, who's the cabinet secretary in the White House. These are people we called all the time and who helped us with storylines. Elena Kagan used to advise us on the show just because we knew them and they were friendly and they watched the show. And what was missing, I think, until January 20th, in my humble opinion, was frankly, and this is not a partisan observation, but people who believe in government and people who believe government is a place you can come together and solve problems. And whether you love Donald Trump or hate him, I'm not going to be partisan here. I was not a fan, but whether you love him or hate him, he was anti-government. He was anti-everything, really. And I think the West Wing is all well and good, but what was missing in our culture is real people. Jen Psaki, people in there who who are real people we can look up to. I mean, Aaron created the West Wing because he met George Stephanopoulos and Dee Dee Myers and Rahm Emanuel and these early young Turks working for Bill Clinton. And he thought, like, these are impressive people. These are people I want to spend time around. These are the people that we wish were working in the White House. And at this moment, they seem to be. They were young, they were energetic, they were idealistic. They fueled, I think, what the West Wing became. And so I guess I would say, you know, I like Veep, I like House of Cards. I can watch all those things and have a great time. Entertainment is entertainment. It's nice when it inspires, but the real thing is more important.
So you have had many hit series since then and are incredibly busy. Just wondering what's your next horizon? What's your next big project?
That's a good, I can't, it's hard to answer that. At the moment, I'm a writer and producer on the TV show Billions, which is on Showtime and shoots in New York, though I'm here remotely because obviously we're in a pandemic and there are not a lot of people physically in rooms together. I'm always looking to do interesting, fun things. And right now I'm having a great time on Billions and, you know, hope to do all kinds of things, original things of mine and things of other people's in the future. So, you know, I'm not looking too far ahead. It's funny because there was the big standoff in Hollywood between the agents and the Writers Guild, which just ended. So I got my agent back after a year and a half. And I also had a baby a little under 9 months ago. So I'm just on the verge of reemerging and taking a look at my career and thinking, what do I actually want to do next? But I have plenty of stuff to keep me busy in the meantime.
Eli Attie is just one of the most lauded writers, producers out there. Thanks so much for being on the program today, sir.
Pleasure, Brent. I really enjoyed it.
Folks, we're going to take a quick break. Don't go anywhere. We'll be right back with the show.
There's a new spin on casual dining near Drake University. Lucky Horse Beer and Burgers. Craveable faves, flatbreads, delicious burgers, frozen cocktails, and a crazy cool vibe. Get to Lucky Horse Beer and Burgers today.
Folks, happy President's Day. Welcome back to the program. As it is with every Monday, so happy to have on former State Representative Karin Derry. Karin, thanks so much for being on today.
Happy to be here.
You know, that interview we just watched with Eli Attie, those episodes of The West Wing where they come to Iowa and they run for president. Obviously you have had your share with candidates here. I've run a couple of those campaigns myself. You know, I think you're a West Wing fan, right?
I am a West Wing fan. I love the show so much. I'm embarrassed to admit how many times I've watched those old episodes.
Yeah, it definitely inspired me to get into politics. I told Richard Schiff when he and I were working on Chasing the Hill, I said, you know, your show is responsible for all this, and then ultimately my run, and then move here to Iowa. So it was fun chatting with Eli. So thank you to Mr. Attie for being on the program. But we're here to talk about real Iowa politics, and a lot of stuff going on. We're right in the middle of the legislative session right now here, mid-February. A lot of squirrely things going on up there right now, one of which redistricting. Why don't you tell people what is going on?
Yeah, well, redistricting is a process that happens every 10 years. It's the year after the census. And the good news is that in Iowa, we have currently a nonpartisan redistricting process. It is set up in Iowa law to be nonpartisan. The Legislative Service Agency coordinates it. We appoint a temporary redistricting advisory committee that helps with that. And written right into the law is a prohibition against considering political parties or trying to protect incumbents in the process. So what the LSA looks at is outlined in the Iowa Code, and they need to create districts that are as close as possible to even by population. They need to coincide with political subdivisions. So there's an effort made to not break up cities, not break up counties to the extent possible. They need to be, the districts need to be contiguous. That means connected with each other, close together, and then they can't be irregularly shaped. So when we think of gerrymandering in those crazy districts and some of those other states that go all snake all over the place, Iowa law is written to prohibit that from happening. So that's the good news. That's what we got good that's going on in Iowa with redistricting.
And if you look at Iowa congressional districts, our Iowa is basically a rectangle, and it's just a plain old grid. It's one of the most beautiful things in politics. The congressional district map here, the 4 districts. And it's so interesting. I just had this conversation with someone who was working on a redistricting campaign out in Virginia, where they're trying to, when I ran for a federal house, the district I was running in, it was this long, skinny thing that was like a block wide, and then it went up the coast from Malibu all the way down to Hermosa Beach, I think it was. But it was the most insane looking thing in the world. And what you realize is they look on the map house to house. Well, let's see, we got a batch of Republicans here, a batch of Democrats here. If we squirrel it this way, then we'll stay in and have more of those votes in this district, giving the other party to the other district. So yeah, it's such a, and the term, folks, it comes from a salamander squiggles and looks weird. And then one of the folks involved with it was Governor Jerry, blah, blah, blah. So gerrymandering come together. And anyway, so you might not have known that.
I did not know that.
That's true. Gerrymandering is supposed to sound like a salamander, because that's what he said it looked like because you could look at these congressional districts in some states, and it's just an absolute mess. But so what's interesting about that, though, that's absolutely one of the reasons Iowa has such close races. So where does it stand right now? Redistricting, so they're just going to go back and consult the census and make sure it follows those rules.
Well, yeah, in theory, that's the way the law works. So the way the law works is that the LSA will draft a map, and they draft it based upon the census information. And typically, they need to draft it, the law says, within 45 days of receiving that information, or by April. Well, now the census this year is delayed, and so it's not entirely clear how this is going to work with the Iowa legislature. One thing that could happen is if the census doesn't come out until the end of July, then they'd likely have to call for a special session for the legislature to adopt the redistricting map. And the way the process works is there's basically, the LSA basically gets 3 tries at drafting this nonpartisan map. And the first time it comes to the legislature, and it's an up or down vote. Either they vote for it or against it. And of course, Republicans are in charge of both the House and the Senate right now in Iowa, so they're the ones who will be deciding whether or not to accept these maps. So first time around, if it's rejected, then the LSA has 45 days to draft another map. And then same thing, it's an up or down vote in the 2 chambers. And then the LSA has another 45 days if it's rejected to draw a third map. The difference with the third map is that with the first 2 maps, the legislature can't amend them. It's an up or down vote. With the third map that's presented by the nonpartisan LSA, the legislature can then amend it if they want to. This process was put in place in 1980, and the legislature has never amended an LSA map. They've either, accepted one of the first 3. But of course, we don't know what's going to happen this session with the Republicans having such a strong majority in both the House and in the Senate.
That their majority is sizable. It increased after the last election. How much I've heard some chatter. How much of that do you ascribe to pandemic and COVID? Where I believe the Democrat Party said don't go door to door. Republicans were still going door to door. How much do you think that pushed them over the top?
I think it had a really important influence on the outcome of the election. My district, I think, is a good example. When I won in 2018, I won by about 1.5%. When I lost in 2020, I lost by about 1.5%. So it's a very, I think it's a swing district. Hasn't always been, but certainly the last 2 elections, we call it that. And this year, given that there is a pandemic going on, I didn't door knock. In 2018, I knocked on thousands of doors. It was a very good way to connect, especially in a district with a sizable amount of independent voters. And, a lot of Democrats made the decision that, we were not going to risk the safety and well-being of our neighbors by going out door to door, talking with people face to face during a pandemic. And I think it made a difference. I think it made a big difference in a lot of districts.
Yeah, I had this conversation with Michael Libby. He's a broadcaster. He ran for state senate here. And he said that, he got a knock on his door from the person who was running in the general against who won, State Senator Sarah Trongariot. But it was the former mayor knocked on his door, and they had a nice conversation. And Michael said, I think that the Democrat Party really missed an opportunity here. And certainly it was understandable. But yeah, knocking on doors and yard signs, I think people maybe on the outside don't realize what sort of impact that has. And I remember, Karin, when you were running in that 2018 campaign, I think you had more signs out in your district than the Democrat nominee for governor that year even.
We had a lot of yard signs. Somewhat early on when I decided, because, I'd never done anything like this before, I decided to run in 2018. So I was getting all kinds of advice. Someone early on said, people say yard signs aren't worth it. I completely disagree. Yard signs are worth every single penny. And I agree as well. And I think it goes back to that idea of, I may not be following state house politics all that closely, but I know my neighbor Bob, and Bob's a good guy. And if he thinks highly enough of Karin Derry to put her yard sign in his yard, then I'm going to be more likely to vote for her. I just think it's a good word of mouth type of thing, yard signs.
Karin, I never even asked you what inspired you to make that change and become a candidate and go serve in the state house. It is a thankless task to do it. What inspired you to do it?
Well, like so many other people after the 2016 election, I was just devastated. The idea of Donald Trump being our president was nothing I had ever envisioned. Someone who talked about women like that, who talked about persons with disabilities like that, who had the kind of history that he had, the idea that almost half of the voters in our country would have elected him was just devastating to me. And as devastating as that was the fact that I hadn't done enough to stop that from happening. I'd been complacent, and I knew I'd been complacent. I put out yard signs, I'd voted, I was caucused, but for Hillary Clinton, I hadn't made a phone call. I hadn't made an important financial contribution. I hadn't knocked on any doors. And I realized that, there was a lot more to being a part of this state and this country than what I'd been doing. And that was also then when the 2016 election is when the Republicans got their trifecta. And in the state of Iowa with the Senate and the House and the governor's seat. And they just started doing horrible things, slashing collective bargaining rights, enacting their, needless voter ID law. The list just went on and on, continuing to underfund our public schools, threatening the future of our public schools with a voucher program, which is similar to what we're seeing now. And Brent, honestly, I just thought to myself, you're not going to get my state, not without a fight. And so I decided to run.
Kind of shifting gears here, and this is a little bit more general Iowa politics, talking about the West Wing and those seasons. I was just chatting with Eli Attie about how that it fascinated me. There was a book called Game Change. It was written about it, the Iowa caucus process that became a movie on HBO. But to see the Santos campaign, the fictionalized Santos campaign, come through New Hampshire, Iowa, and all that sort of thing. You'd lived here and you'd seen it then on the show, etc. But I'm wondering now that 2020 wasn't the best year for the Iowa caucuses, the Buttigieg and Sanders campaigns, etc., and the delayed count and all that. Where do you see the future of the caucuses? Will this be something that you'll be advocating for, or what do you think we should be doing as far as presidential politics here in the state?
I mean, people have said, I've heard numerous people say that, every 4 years we hear it's the end of the Iowa caucuses. And it turns out that it's not. So I'm a little skeptical when I hear that about this last caucus. A couple things. One is that in Iowa, we take our presidential politics very, very seriously, and people show up to meet candidates, and I was so fortunate as a state rep to be able to meet so many of our presidential candidates, and they would tell me that the questions, the policy questions, the informed questions that they'd get from Iowans was, really interesting, and they were impressed with that. So that's one side of it, and I appreciate that. And of course, whatever state's playing that kind of important role in choosing our next president, we want the voters there to be very, well informed and to take it very seriously. So that's one side. I can't say that the criticism of the Iowa caucuses, or the first caucus in the nation, being in a state that lacks as much diversity as Iowa does, I can't say that criticism is not warranted. So that's my long-winded way of saying, it kind of cuts both ways, Brent. And I would understand if the decision were made that Iowa weren't the first, although I'd be terribly disappointed because I do think that we take it seriously and we do a very good job with it.
You mentioned the caliber of the questions. I had the fortune of running John Delaney's Iowa show. And he said, when he does events in other states, Maryland, where he's from, it's just a different type of thing. You get a little bit of that. But here it feels like you're being interviewed by, George Stephanopoulos. You got to be up on your stuff. And I always thought that was really interesting. Someone had been elected to Congress 3 times. He knew that when he came to Iowa, he had to be, up to the minute, ready on news and reaction, and have a statement on that, and not just for the press, but for just a plain old coffee shop get together and all that sort of thing. And I ended up moving here for the caucuses basically, and so Doug Burns and I started a group, Keep Iowa First. So I'm definitely in the pro caucuses camp, but always interested to see, especially folks like yourself who've done the hard work to get elected to serve in state legislature. And so now that you've had a little bit of time since you were in the Iowa House, what do you kind of look back? What are your feelings to that time that you spent up there? And I'm not trying to have you make an early press release, but what's your future in politics going to be?
Well, I have promised my husband that I won't run for office again. So, he said, let's not do this anymore. You can help in other ways, Karen. And I said, okay, all right. That was in November. It was an incredible honor to serve the people of the district, and I enjoyed the work very much. It's so interesting. I don't think most people realize the breadth of topics that comes before the Iowa legislature, and I just, because I'm kind of a nerd, the kind of person who loves the West Wing, I really got into that and really enjoyed that kind of work so much. And if I could, if I could just wave a magic wand and be back at the Capitol serving, I would love that so much. But I guess, wise people have told me never say never. And so I'm not saying never yet, but at this point, I don't have any plans to run again. But one way or the other, I'm going to be involved in the elections in 2022 because I'm going to be working really hard to make sure that we get more Democrats at the State House, in both the Senate and in the House and in the governor's seat. Because, I think, we can look at what's happening right now, and I continue to believe that this is not what most Iowans want for our state.
Former State Representative Karin Derry, always a pleasure to have you on the program. Very grateful, Karin. Thank you so much for being with us.
Good to see you, and try to stay warm through this cold freeze.
Yeah, folks, if you're watching this out of state, we've got single digits. We've got -10, -14, wind chills of -30. It's the stuff that I would see when I was in California, and I would say, oh, that's why I don't live there. But we're going to get through it. The spring will be here before you know it. All right, folks, we're going to take a quick break and more right after this. Don't go anywhere.
There's a new spin on casual dining near Drake University. Lucky Horse Beer and Burgers. Craveable faves, flatbreads, delicious burgers, frozen cocktails, and a crazy cool vibe. Get to Lucky Horse Beer and Burgers today.
Folks, that is our program for today. Again, Wednesday, you're going to want to check out my live conversation with State Representative Ross Wilburn there, talking about what's going on in the Capitol, what's going on in national politics. Of course, there he is with now Vice President Kamala Harris. He was one of her chief advisors. We're going to be talking about that and really how the Iowa caucuses once again had such a huge impact in the national discussion, and now who's presiding in the White House and in the presidency and the vice presidency. So looking forward to that chat with Ross. I couldn't thank you folks enough for tuning in and being a part of our show here. Another fine episode. So we look forward to seeing you next time. We'll see you then.